become the kind of person that is able to feel so deeply that they believe in something enough to die for it. I think that's the goal. And I'm not saying the goal is dying, because a lot of people get that mixed up with like, I'm going to go martyr myself. Be willing to.
Hello there, and welcome to Mostly Harmless. I'm your host, Alan Steele, and my guest today is Garrett Dailey. Garrett is a philosopher, a writer, an entrepreneur, a graphic designer, a man of many talents and a diverse background. So welcome to the show, Garrett.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So I've got some notes here. There's a bunch of things that I want to dive into. You run a blog called Master Self, or it's, masterthyself.com, which is a motivational self-help philosophy kind of blog. You actually have 2 books out, which I'll just show for the camera: Master Self Year 1 and Master Self Year 2, which are collections of articles from this blog. So to start off, let's start with the current situation. We're obviously in lockdown or emerging from lockdown at the time of this recording. And you have lots of people that are stuck at home without work, maybe without purpose, not being able to see their friends and things like that. So in that context, why is it important to master yourself? Why is that important to you?
So one of the things that I've written about, I think I only wrote 2 articles as a result of the lockdown because we've been busy doing so much other stuff. But one of the things that I wrote about when I directly addressed the coronavirus situation was that this was something like a societal level shamanic crisis. And at the risk of weirding out everyone listening, that's roll with me. So in societies that predate modern style religions, you usually had like a medicine man or a shaman or whatever, and he would be determined to be the guy that would be the shaman because he would have some kind of childhood thing that would happen. For some people, it was you get bit by a snake and they leave you to die, and then you didn't die, or you maybe got struck by lightning and you survived, or just some kind of random thing that should have killed you and didn't. And so from this, we kind of draw the story of the wounded healer. Chiron, who trained Hercules, if I remember correctly, he at least trained some of the Greek heroes, was also a wounded healer. He was wounded by an arrow, and that gave him the ability to teach, which is kind of a weird thought process. But basically, it was this notion of being sickened or injured, brought close to death and coming back, that gave you the authority to heal, right? To fix things. And so with the coronavirus crisis, we literally have, a global virus that has sickened the world. And what we're seeing is not just the physiological illness that's making people sick, but our lockdown scenario, which is like the immune response at scale. And in this time of kind of, seclusion, it forces us to self-reflect, right? And if we go off of the historical model, we actually have this great opportunity to come back and start to look at the way that we do things, because we have so much free time to do so. There's a lot of, and I'm actually guilty of doing this, there are a lot of times where when we live in the world, and I use that in the sense of the Buddhist concept of in the world. So not just literally being in the world, because even right now we're literally in the world at all times, unless you're Neil Armstrong. But in the world, being participating in the social world that we live in, right? They contrast that concept with being renouncing the world, going to go be a monk or live in a monastery or live in the woods or whatever. And this experience for many of us is much closer to that than we're ever going to get. So to have this time where you kind of take a step back and reflect, and you are further removed from your social life and your social obligations, I think it's the first time that many of us have ever really had to sit and think about stuff. I mean, how much of the world is built on us not sitting and thinking about stuff? We watch TV to distract ourselves. I have watched plenty of TV during the lockdown, you know, because you get bored and you get uncomfortable. Dealing with yourself for any great length of time means you're going to actually have to look at the way you're living your life, and then you start to see, like, I have some extremely extroverted friends. For the record, I'm extremely introverted most of the time. So this for me has been mostly normal. I lived alone in the desert for a good length of time. So this is, it is what it is. It's like a mini vacation for me. But for my extroverted friends, they're having a terrible time with it, right? To lose that kind of thing that energizes you and that thing that you kind of relate yourself to with other people is troubling, especially because it's very easy if you're a social person, you have lots of friends, to have that kind of, I don't want to say distraction because that trivializes the social relationship, but this a thing that keeps you from self-reflecting, right? Or from being alone. Because that's, I mean, good self-reflection comes when we're alone, and then maybe later you learn to self-reflect in relationship to other people, but a lot of people never have that. So to bring kind of that ramble back, I think it's so critical that we self-reflect, because when we live in the world all the time, when we don't take a moment to remember who we are, it's very easy for us to start living someone else's life or living in a manner that doesn't reflect who we want to be. I mean, we all know the trope of the guy who wakes up at 40 and quits his job and buys a sports car because he realized he's miserable. But we don't really have a trope for the person who preemptively doesn't get to that point, because our culture doesn't really provide for that.
So I hear a lot of what you're saying, and there's this potentially really positive aspect to this quarantine, to this time by ourselves, because we live in this world where we're inundated with news and entertainment and just constantly being stimulated by these things. But obviously, a lot of people are going to have trouble with that, and are just going to, I don't know. I hate to be pessimistic about it, but I feel like a lot of people are just going to be kind of depressed and out of their comfort zone. So, what do you think is the path to finding the positive potential of that?
So, if you there's a concept that I wrote an article about a long time ago called the pencil model. The article, for reference, is The Candlemaker's Fallacy, Innovation, Pencils, and Metallica, I think is the subtitle. But the premise, aside from the article itself, the premise is that you have, if you can imagine a Ticonderoga #2 pencil, you have the lead, which is innovative people. It makes up a very small proportion of the population. These are people who lead, right? They are innovators. They show us the way forward. You have kind of that, we've been calling it supporters because we use this for like business development kind of meetings and stuff. It's a good metaphor, but the part of the wood that supports the lead, these are your early adopters. You have the bulk of the wood is most people, right? They're going to buy it when you make it easy for them to buy the thing or try the new thing when it's not crazy and novel and risky. And then you have the feral, which is like people that will never change their mind, and the eraser, which is people that actively work against you. But for the sake of this, I'm only really concerned with the first half of the pencil, because by that point you've gotten over the hump and it's a normal thing now, right? In these cases, there are people that deal with the problems of the world long before other people even know they exist, right? This is why you can see much of the malaise of our, the 2010s predicted with movies like Fight Club or American Beauty or Office Space, right? Obviously, these were representative of their times as well, but those kind of things really only just started hitting the mainstream. And fairly, to be fair, a lot of that has been going on for a lot longer than that. But a good example of this is like Nietzsche. Nietzsche was actually so far ahead of the curve that nobody cared while he was alive. He was basically irrelevant until later that people were ready to start dealing with the stuff that he anticipated, right? And so in the sense that there are people who hit quarantine and they're depressed and they're miserable, well, I don't think it's necessarily quarantine that caused that, with the exception of and that may sound a little bit like cruel or harsh to say, but I think a lot of this stuff is latent, and the quarantine reveals it, in the same sense that if you get coronavirus and you happen to be 500 pounds, you're probably going to die, but it's not specifically coronavirus. It's the underlying condition, because coronavirus tends not to kill people.
Right. So the environment
right.
exacerbates the existing problem.
Right. And in that sense, I think that there are a lot of us who, even before this all happened, have actually started making progress in solving these things. I think it's unfortunate because there are people that this crisis is going to be the thing that really leads to their demise in one way or another. But I think that I don't know, I can see it, and I think you may be able to see it, and hopefully the listeners can see it. But I'm actually more optimistic than I was at the beginning, because at the beginning of the coronavirus stuff, I was like, oh, we got like 4 days after the food runs out and people are going to start looting. So I went and bought a machete. I was like, all right, we're going Mad Max, you know? And I don't think that's the case now, even though there's been actually a substantial amount of like quote unquote paramilitary activity and stuff. I actually think that a lot of people are coming together and realizing the importance of stuff like building community and being out in nature and being healthy and all of that in a way that we didn't notice before. And hopefully this is turning more into a wake-up call and potentially even an impetus for change, positive change, than it is a horrible catastrophe, which it might still be. I'm not excited about the economic impact, but I think we're at the beginning of something new, and that there's some kind of a way forward that was not obvious before.
So I like a lot of the stuff you said there, especially about just making us more aware of some of the things that we maybe took for granted before. So to kind of change tack a little bit, going back to the idea of mastering yourself, and especially since at this point, many people, that's all they have is just their own self. You can't rely on society. You can't rely on anything else. So I want to point out something that you've done, which is you mentioned that you lived in the desert for how long was it?
I literally lived in the desert in a tent for 30 days.
30 days.
Plus
Okay.
or minus a few days. But as far as when I moved from here a couple years ago, I lived in both Colorado and Nevada for a grand total of like 2 years.
Sure.
So,
okay. So, but literally in a tent in the desert. So you've had some practice living in solitude. But one thing that I also want to point out is you've done a 40-day fast. And, you know, I did like a 5-day fast last year, and all my friends thought I was crazy. But 40 days, that's something else. So can you just speak to that experience and what that was like for you?
Yeah. So basically, I'll explain briefly kind of how I got into fasting. So when I was in college, I did not like college. I never really wanted to go to college, and I only went to get out of my hometown. I got there. I would not change it in the past, even though I still have a crippling load of debt from that, and that's a shame. But I made a lot of good friends. I would not be where I am now without the people that I met, so it was well worth it, even at that expense. But when I was there, I was miserable, right? I was totally, that was the lowest point of my life. I had tried to drink myself to death for some length of time. I was probably drunk for 6 months straight, like no exaggeration. So I dropped out of school, started business with a buddy of mine, and I think to myself while I was in the early stages of that business, I was like, well, when was the last time you were sober for like a month? And I thought about it, and to include caffeine and stuff. I don't know. I couldn't think of the last time that I had no substances for any length of time like that, right? So I was like, all right, I'll do 40 days of sobriety. In the first few days of that, I learned about fasting. And so I decided what I would do is this thing that I've detailed on the website that you can actually do yourself, what I call the 10-day challenge. But basically on day 20 of no, that was the finer points aren't important, but I started doing 10 days of intermittent fasting. Then I did 10 days of 1 day of fasting and 1 day off of fasting. And then I did 10 days of 2 days on, 1 day off. And eventually
you built up to it.
Yeah, which you need to do something like that. Part of it is that you have to like train yourself, the reflex of eating. You have to just get rid of that. So if you get used to, I'm not going to eat lunch, I'm going to go to work and I'm not going to go on lunch break and get food, or I'm not going to wake up and cook something, or I'm not going to eat a snack when I get home. You're kind of overriding that default impulse thing, right? And then the other part of it is it really does ease you into it. I personally think that day 3 is the hardest of all. So if you can get, day 3 is when your insulin levels are dropped before the ketosis really starts kicking in and you're really like craving stuff. After 3 days, you're not hungry anymore. By day 5 at the latest. I've gotten so used to it that I pretty much don't get hungry anymore if I am going to do a fast. But especially the first time, I remember day 3, I was miserable. And then by day 5, you're like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then day 7, you start getting high. And I remember specifically day 21 of the 40-day fast, which is the first long fast I ever did. I woke up and I was like, I don't remember the last time I felt this good. I just felt amazing. I wasn't depressed. It was awesome, right? And that my goal was 40 days. I got to 40 days and I could have kept going if I wanted to. I did not want to, and I broke my fast on apple juice and watermelon the night of. I actually may have only done like 39 days and 23 hours or something, but I don't know that for sure. I did wait until midnight. So
that counts, yeah. So I feel like it's necessary to say at this point, that neither of us, I'm pretty sure, are medically trained, and we're not advising that, but there's something interesting which, and I want to be really careful to extricate what I'm about to say from any kind of political implications, but something I've been concerned about recently is the kind of worship of experts in the culture, and how at the same time there's been this kind of counterculture surgence of people kind of testing things out for themselves and just experimenting and bucking the trends of what experts are saying. And you're a prime example of that, trying a 40-day fast and the carnivore diet and all sorts of other things. So I just want to, can you speak to that, just the culture of expert, the sort of expert priestly class?
Yeah, so basically, back in the day when let's say it's the 1300s, you're a Viking in a village. If it's a storm and there's thunder and lightning, you can be like, oh, hey, Thor's hitting his hammer on the anvil, whatever. That's a perfectly acceptable explanation. Frankly, a cooler one than we have now, but oh well. And then all of a sudden we get the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and science, and we basically say that the only valid method of saying that anything is happening is rationality, which effectively is, I mean, there are so many stories that talk about this. This is the story of Faust. Is we put the rational mind in the aspiring to the place of God. So no longer can you say, oh, hey, God made the rules. We said we have to figure out what the rules are, and the only thing that's valid for doing that is the rational mind, which actually for a lot of stuff works, and it works very, very well. And there are a lot of the people that would argue against that, like that are just actually anti-science for the sake of being anti-science. But for a lot of stuff, science is really good. The only thing that it totally is bad at is producing systems of meaning. And so we end up with what Nietzsche called, and it was somebody else called it that before him, but he's usually the person that we refer to because he was the one that really explained it, the death of God. God's dead, and who are we to, we killed him. We can never wash the blood off our hands. We must become something better to be worthy of this crime or something like that. And he's not happy about that. That's not like he's not saying, haha, we did it, checkmate, checkmate theists, It was that he was acknowledging this is bad. We've lost a source of meaning in the world. We've lost the idea of an ordering principle. And because of that, all we have is a cold, dead universe full of stuff, tangible stuff. And only the tangible stuff is real. From this, you get it was already happening, but you get the modern academy. And the modern academy, because we said the only way of knowing things is through the scientific method, through the rational mind, right? You get the religion of this, because all systems that claim to have sole claim on the truth value become a religion, because effectively that is what a religion is saying we have the truth value. Let's build a structure around that. So the structure of the religion of scientism is, there's the method. There's the people who are authorized to practice the method. That's where they fucked up, because the scientific method is awesome. And if you're genuinely about it and rigorous, anyone can do that, right? Anyone can, there's no veil in the temple, so to speak. But that requires you to be, if we're going to belabor the metaphor, a penitent person who has cleansed themselves and to do the ritual earnestly. In non-metaphor, it's being honest and questioning your assumptions and doing the act of science is something anyone can do. However, because we don't like being honest and questioning our assumptions and being earnest and, doing the hard thing, which is saying, I might be wrong, let's explore that. We outsource to science !TM, which is scientism, the notion that scientists are infallible people who dispense truth from their divine authority, which is their sole contact with the scientific method, which is it's the most perfect analogy of this is like the Pharisees. If for people who don't understand the vagaries of pre-Christian Judaism, on the holiest day of the year, which I believe is Yom Kippur, the high priest would go up into the temple, into a room called the Holy of Holies, right? Which is like, that's not a perfect translation, but basically it was like, if holy isn't a thing, it's applying the term holy to that. So it's the double holy thing, right? Anyway, on the holiest day of the year, for 1 hour, the high priest would go in there behind the veil, which actually was a much thicker, more substantial thing, and talk to God. And he would come out and they would go deal with their lives, right? He was the only person that was allowed to do it. So Christianity, one of the salient parts of the story that gets left out is when Christ dies on the cross, the sky goes dark and the veil in the temple is torn. And what this means is that, Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you, right? The body is the temple. What he's saying is, hey, guess what? You don't need that guy to go talk to God for you anymore. You can do it yourself. To demystify that in the sense of science, we basically have the institution of the Pharisees, these people who believe that there's a rigorous rule-based system by which we can get truth out of this magical process via the priests, right? And it's pretty obvious the fact that there weren't scientists doing science before science was invented, and yet we still got knowledge out of the world. That even though the scientific method is a valuable way of gaining information, I think we've learned that it's not producing meaning. We get a world that feels very meaningless and synthetic and tangible, but not touching, right? And I guess the thing that we have to come to is how do we move past the cult of scientism towards a system of knowledge that provides meaning and is accessible to you and I.
So, yeah, I completely agree. To play devil's advocate for a second, is it possible that it's just sort of corruption of the system, that if we were to parse out the corrupt influence of science, or take it from answering questions that it shouldn't be answering, that we could build a whole value system, a system of meaning, that we could have that in a scientific system? Or is it a fundamental problem with our reliance on science, culturally speaking?
That's a really good question. So you can look at, first off, there's what I see, and almost the entirety of my work is built on this premise. But what I see is the fundamental failing of science is that, and it doesn't mean failing as in what it is good at and able to do is not good and functional, because it does have a sphere in which it is the ideal system, right? But when it comes to the nature of being itself, the subjective part of reality, right? If science is allowed to look at the entirety of the world and to say this is the only way of dealing with the world at all, then we basically run into the issue of either trying to deny the subjective or trying to objectify the subjective, which is not possible, right? The objective and subjective components of human nature do not, even though they require each other and they are inseparable, they do not overlap directly, right? Meaning, the best example of this that you can kind of see what I mean is behaviorism. So there's a guy named B.F. Skinner. He did a bunch of experiments. His whole premise, and I'll simplify this, and I might paraphrase this poorly, but basically, if you have a dog and you kick the dog and the dog winces and yelps, right? Behaviorism says that there's not a thing inside the dog that experiences the pain. All we know is that pain input causes wince, yelp output, right? And it basically tries to reduce people into things that have no internal experience. So you get a bunch of other things that branch off from this extreme rationality, which is that simulation hypothesis, the idea that we're created and we're not fundamentally real, and that we live in a computer simulation, which is, again, just a different kind of religious theory. It's a modern version of the concept of Maya, or illusion, right? That the world is fake, or Gnosticism, right? It really is just Gnosticism, which Gnosticism is cool, so I can't blame people. It's a cool religion, but it's very dark. So when you try to make a system out of pure rationality, like one of the best attempts to do this was what Rand did. Ayn Rand has a system called objectivism, which basically, she won't admit that it has a lot more subjectivity in it than she intended or perceived it as having. But it was an attempt at deriving a system of values completely objectively from the nature of reality. So her premise is that existence exists. Life is the first value. And if you're going to live in the world, you have to value life, and all the other things draw from that. We can extrapolate what are things that go towards life. That's a really great idea. I think life is a prerequisite. That would be where I distinguish. Life is a prerequisite for value, because dead people don't value anything. But anyway, that, however well coherent it seemingly failed to catch on in a meaningful way. She is very impactful as a writer, but I attribute that to her aesthetic impact being very beautiful. Like the notion of man's life is this noble concept that is very much built into her, and she got a lot of that from Victor Hugo, right? It's very uplifting, and I think that was why she was impactful, because most serious philosophers ignore her outright. She was very anti-academic, though. They really did not like her. She had nothing nice to say to the academy. She also had no formal training, so that most people, again, cult of science, they would kind of rule her out. So this is kind of a tricky thing. Sorry, I'm still in the vague half of my answer.
No, it's fine. It's a good question. Let me introduce another element to it, which is that you found a kind of niche talking and writing about mythology, about religions from a more meta perspective. Why? I mean, with the arrival of certain characters like Jordan Peterson, and there's now this emphasis, which I didn't see 10 years ago, on Jungian archetypes and the importance of mythology. So with that in mind, why is that? I guess why is that becoming more prominent in trying to answer this question of how we structure our lives in a world that is so focused on rationality and on science?
So the first thing before the pre-rational experience of the death of God is basically coming to terms with the mechanical nature of the world, right? Before you realize what happened, you feel that life is ugly or stifling. Modern life is ugly or stifling or mechanical or soulless or any of these things, right? And the people who dealt with it before it was explicitly rational, and I mean, these are people who were like Jung, for example, is explicitly rational, but he deals with a lot of mysticism. Like my introduction to him was 2 books, which were Man and His Symbols, which is an amazing, amazing book, and a book not written by him called Jung the Mystic, that talks about his bizarre life. He had a lot of weird stuff. One of the things that he said when he was a kid, he was sitting in church and he had a vision of God opening up the sky and taking a shit on the church. And he said that was the beginning of his career, like, and what got him into researching that, because he thought, like, well, if the world is this crazy sacred thing, then that's blasphemous. But on the other hand, I have to assume that I received that vision for a reason. And that kind of set him on this weird kind of heterodox path, right? So you get people like, there were a lot of people actually that were into this before, 2 of the most notable people being Jung and Joseph Campbell, right? Although they were the ones that are, I think, synthesize things enough to be comprehensible. There's Jung, though, is really is a founding member of modern psychology, although people like to pretend like he was wrong about lots of stuff. He was right about a lot of stuff, but they don't like the mysticism element. Same reason that Freud disowned him, among others. But there were people writing all this mythological stuff. And actually, if you look at the 1800s, you had people like the Theosophical Society, Helena Blavatsky, and Gurdjieff, and a bunch of Manly P. Hall. You had that rebirth of esoterica, because I think that was the first wave of like, ooh, modernity's not really doing it for me. But it was super obscure. It was super weird. People were having seances, and the Winchester lady built that mansion with all, in California, with all the staircases that lead into the ceiling and doors that walk out of the house and whatever. So you get waves of, here's kind of a little bit of pushback and a little bit of prominence of, like, we return to the nobility of modernity, and then pushback. And there's always tension, I guess. But we start really seeing the cracks come out of, I think, the Holocaust. Because what the Holocaust showed us was, whatever version of religion you thought we had, if you thought there was a deity that was going to stop bad things from happening, he obviously, well, you either have to say, well, God wanted the Holocaust to happen, which I can't imagine a version of deity that isn't a Gnostic fucking hell that would do that. Or he doesn't work the way that we thought he did, and he actually isn't going to do anything, right? So how do we come to terms with that? Modernity had produced the most awful war machine, human meat grinding apparatus in the history of the world, right? Just millions and millions of people dead. And that doesn't even get into like the communist murders. 100 million people dead in 100 years from communism, So we tried to make these synthetic human-centered things, and they just shredded people, right? And they were both different aspects of that, because Nazism was like we have this very much Germanic human excellence thing that we're going to value. And then communism was like, well, it's the inherent nobility of man that has been crushed by the capitalistic machine, right? We're going to free that from the grasp of the bourgeoisie. And both of these killed people. Both of them were like, the world has this thing that we have to fight for our thing to exist. And that is so dehumanizing, right? You get the 60s out of that, and their anti-war thing is like, oh my God, we can't go back. But really, the 60s were a blind grasping against the violence. It wasn't a solution, right? There was nothing really produced other than lots of great music and art. There was nothing like concrete and tangible produced because it was a rebellion against the rationality. It's like, let's go get fucked out of our gourds and reject the world. We're going to go inside. And so that kind of is ironic because that set up the 80s. So all these kids that lived in the 60s grew up to be fucking middle managers. And then we get another rebellion, which is like the 90s, which is the kind of the whole aesthetic of grunge, which is like, fuck the man. I'm going to be, Fight Club and Office Space. I don't give a fuck kind of apathy. Because at this point, we're reduced to apathy. The 60s had activism, but now it's resignment. And so then you get the 2000s, which have almost no character about them, right? I don't know if people remember, but like early 2000s was kind of like weird tech future and the Spice Girls, and it was like completely consumeristic, and it didn't withstand the 2000s. You get 9/11, you get the last time we really united about anything, right? Which was 9/11. And that wasn't enough to hold it together because by the end of the decade, we're all sick of the war. We're all completely uninspired. And then social media comes to cap it all off. So I think the reason why you get the thing that we didn't have 10 years ago is actually the counter effect of the internet. Because the first effect of the internet was the final commercialization of the world. Everything's a targeted ad now. Everything is hyper niche marketing and selling you dumb shit from China, the drop shipping guys, right? But the counter effect of that is the progressive democratization of information, right? The ease of access to things like Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia has probably done more good than any other individual thing on the internet as far as giving people the ability to educate themselves. Or YouTube, even though YouTube on the top level is this like corporate, let's hyper niche music video targeting and making things that are so like banal to the point of absurdity. And under that, you get people, specifically Jordan Peterson's a good example because he was just a teacher who put his lectures on YouTube for 10 years, right? And actually having done that for 10 years consistently is the reason why, if you understand how their algorithm works, it's actually the reason why he got big in the first place. It's not because of the pronouns shit. That was just an inevitability that a person who had been producing content for that length of time got the exposure from doing what he was doing already, right?
That was the trigger for everybody to find all the material that he already had there. So I hadn't planned on going in this direction, but just since we're on the topic, what do you make of, I mean, now we're seeing, let me start this out by, we've seen for a while that there's been this issue of censorship on the internet and on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And now, for instance, with the coronavirus stuff, people that disagree with the WHO are apparently contradicting YouTube's policies. If this is such a positive force of information being democratized and now everybody can educate themselves, what's the shadow side to that? What's the danger there?
Well, you're seeing it as the academy, the rejection, and I say the academy as the broad concept of the intellectual class that resulted from people like the philosophical basis of people like Descartes and Kant and Hegel and Marx, and these foundational academic concepts that all of the academy is built on that, right? The educational institutions and their kind of formal claim on truth telling, right? Their formal sole proprietorship of the concept of lowercase t truth, right? Nobody really in the academy is advocating for a capital T truth. That's different. But so what we're seeing, because of the democratization of educational resources, YouTube, Wikipedia, stuff like that, the academy is actually rebelling against that. And so because there is a political element to the academy is obviously left-leaning, and everyone knows that. It also has kind of a self-correcting mechanism internally that has made it progressively more left-leaning. If you hear about people who are more centrist or right-leaning in the academy, it kind of seeks to eliminate those people and silence those voices. That creates two things. And it's unfortunate that it's politicized because it didn't have to be. And now it inevitably is, because the academy itself is politicized. But what we're seeing is alternative sources of basically n equals 1. We're seeing what the alternative sources of information are: the belief that n equals 1 is a valuable source of information, whereas science does not traditionally value n equals 1 as much as it values properly done surveys and studies and peer-reviewed stuff, right?
Can you just explain that, the n equals 1?
Yeah. So n equals 1 is what you is a term that means the sample size, meaning the people that I've tested this thing on is myself or one person. It means it's, the academy would probably say hearsay, or there's a variety of terms for it. But
anecdote.
I am n equals 1 for fasting, doing carnivore, running marathons, all of the stuff. My blog is 100% n equals 1. I don't speak for anyone else. And I don't attribute any kind of scientific validity to anything that I do past n equals 1, me, and what I represent. And so that actually is the really interesting part, because now that I've articulated this because you asked me to, I've kind of just clicked in my head that the reason why it's because this relies on an internal concept of self to function. I am testing things on myself, whereas science believes that you get tests out of tangible data, right? There's no element of subjective experience in the scientific method. It denies the validity of the subjective experience, or n equals 1. And so this rebellion is the reassertion of the individual self, the ability of you to educate without the institution, right? Which is actually very dangerous if you think about, if we're running a country that is predicated on certain agreed concepts like America's a free country, or any number of things that most Americans would agree on like that, right? There are, it's tricky if all of a sudden the standardization mechanism of that, which is the educational system and writ large the academy, right? If you take that out, then how do we know people are going to agree on anything? We can't standardize it anymore, right? What if people start thinking their own thoughts? That's a dangerous game to play.
Well, so I wonder if everybody has kind of recognized that you're in your own bubble, especially with social media, and you get recommended videos and this sort of thing, and all the algorithms are controlling what you see and the information that you're receiving. So the n equals 1 idea, isn't there this danger of you're just going to keep shrinking your bubble of experience? I want to pull up a quote that I really liked that you made in one of your articles, which is, any sufficiently advanced marketing is indistinguishable from religion. And just with that thought in mind, well, maybe can you explain that a little bit and speak to the idea of, how do we escape just ever shrinking bubbles of subjective experience?
So that quote is a paraphrase, I believe, of Isaac Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke. I always get those two mixed up because they're both super geniuses and they've both been very impactful on my thinking. But the original quote is, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The premise of that, I do a lot of for whatever reason, I hate marketing, but I do marketing for a living. And I've tried to endeavor to find a way to do it ethically and I've written about in the Beyond Influence series that I did with a number of other writers in our sphere about why marketing is so awful and where the root of marketing comes from a guy named Edward Bernays, or Edmund Bernays. Anyway, Freud's nephew. He's a real bastard. One of the things about that quote is that a business, the structure of a business, let's say I sell, let's say I'm Walmart, right? Well, if you're going to work at Walmart, the people that are, at least if I'm going to start Walmart, let's put it that way, right? You have to believe in the thing enough to go through all of the hurdles that are inherent in starting a business, which is a nightmare. I've started many businesses and failed almost as many businesses, and the other ones are in the neutral Schrodinger zone of not having failed yet. So the most important thing at the beginning of a business is either you have a thing that's already making money or convincing people that it could make money at some point if everything works out. And that is like something like a faith claim. I need you to believe in the vision, right? The mission statement. So it's a lot easier if you're Walmart and you have, like, I'm Sam Walton and I have a little mom and pop shop that I run, and then I'm just going to make more of them, and then I'm going to build the supply chain and all of that, right? But it doesn't just require you to believe in it. It requires your consumer to believe in it too. And actually, we have this idea that religions require a huge amount of belief, but a business, we've actually gotten very efficient. The amount of belief that you need from your purchaser is, this product is going to make my life better. And actually what make my life better is a very, very narrow thing. It's like, I need to eat, so I'm going to buy some beans, right? Okay, that's enough. I believe these people aren't selling poison doesn't actually cross your mind. You don't think that far about it. You just think need, want, get, right? Generally, part of marketing that we don't think about is actually the legitimacy, the notion of legitimacy. So if I don't have legitimacy, then the person is going to think, is this a scam, right? Am I buying poison? Are these beans bad, right? If you have legitimacy, which I think is a prerequisite to doing any kind of business, then people don't have that thought at all, and you just buy. If I'm going to go buy some bullshit from China online, does this store look like it's going to steal my credit card information? Oh no, they're running PayPal. Okay. All right, I'll buy it. We have a certain degree of trust built into the system now that e-commerce functions, but people didn't used to believe that it worked. And in all senses, people didn't used to believe that supplements were a good thing, which is why we have the notion of snake oil salesmen, right? Nowadays, we have GNC. You can generally believe that things that you buy at GNC at least have some amount of what they claim to have in them, because the store makes enough money and people aren't dying left and right from buying supplements, right? So there's a kind of belief in all religions are actually, all companies and are actually sub-religions within the greater religion of consumerist capitalism, right? We have this understanding that the way the world works is I make things and sell them, you buy them, we can exchange goods. This is all built on such prophets as Adam Smith and other economists, right? We have different flavors of this across the world because some people are more laissez-faire and less laissez-faire. Everyone's kind of been moving less laissez-faire because we're afraid of the uninhibited religion now, the pagan capitalism of just do whatever the fuck you want. But so when I'm marketing something, go ahead.
Let me just stop you there. Isn't it different from a religion in the sense that if the company makes something that kills you, well, then people lose respect in it. They don't want to buy from it anymore. So there's a kind of empirical side to it that, you know, you're making claims about things, what you're selling, that can be tested, can't they?
I mean, there are a lot of people who stayed with their religion after their God lost the war, right? So we have an irrational predisposition to it's sunk cost fallacy, so that we are more likely to do the thing we were doing already, even if it hurts to do. because the amount of effort required to change is significantly higher than to keep doing what we're doing, which is why religions tend to die out, because the people get killed and not because they're abandoned, right? Usually your religion dies with your society. Now, in the same sense, it's more likely that your company actually falls apart because your thing kills people. But then again, Ford had Pintos that literally exploded if they got hit from behind, and yet Ford's still around. So that's a part of marketing too, is, oh, hey, God didn't fail us. It's just you weren't supposed to win that war because reason. So I've marketed my way out of that seemingly obvious rational failure of logical consequences, right? In the same sense, what's a company that sells something that kills people that's still around? Well, McDonald's. Look at Super Size Me, right? Super Size Me was about as empirical as you could say. Hey, these people are literally going out of their way to market you stuff that's going to make you dead or ill. And they pivoted to pretending like having a salad full of sugar is a good option. I don't know, but they do it and they survived with seemingly no loss of momentum. I don't know. They're still as prevalent as they were before. They McFresh bullshit. I don't, you know?
So to kind of pull back from this a little bit, I think most people who are cosmopolitan and, you know, humanist and they like reason, they like the scientific method, you know, at least in theory, there's this idea that, well, can't we just figure out how to make this work right? Can't we just solve, you know, come up with a great system for everything for culture, for society to just function well? Do we have to rely on religious thinking? Do we have to rely on myths? Is there, I don't know, what do you think of that?
Ultimately, the thing that I've begun to think that the death of God is not so much the death of God, but the death of faith, right? We've moved to a reliance on empirical ways of knowing, which leave nothing to account for with faith, right? This is problematic. However, what is more problematic is trying to live in the modern world while making faith claims, because that, I don't remember who that guy is, but for example, the preacher that tried to blow the coronavirus away, he is operating on faith claims, and I would say pretty dubious ones. But on the other hand, I think what part of the issue really is that in our eagerness to explain everything with reason, we actually started putting reason in a realm where it isn't supposed to go. And we've killed that realm by filling it up with reason. And thus, if we're only accepting things we can get proof for, we've killed anything that we can't get proof for, even though it really should never have gone there, right? What that ultimately is, I think, is the subjective experience of consciousness, right? You can't, it's something like an a priori. It existed, right? It already was. Not in the sense that Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, which I think is a different kind of naive, but a lot of science has tried, science exclamation point TM, not science, the scientific method, but scientists and the scientific community have tried to explain away consciousness, because that solves, if we can say there's no subjective consciousness and it's not a meaningful thing, we can explain away the need for, or the want even, for those things, the longing for meaning, right? Because we can say nothing matters. Your consciousness is a lie. It's an illusion, right? It's a simulation. It's whatever. The issue is, there are a couple parts of this. One, we have to have something that basically we need to find, to paraphrase somebody who figured this stuff out long before we did, I think, or at least thought about it. We need to find our mustard seed worth of faith. However, you can't cross the streams. You have to leave reason in its place, because reason is good for all kinds of stuff. It's really good at those things. You can't beat it with in its realm with things that aren't related to reason, right? However, it can't deal with any of that other stuff at all. And you'll actually end up screwing yourself up if you try to use it for those things, which is...
So yeah, can you kind of demarcate what those realms are? So you've got the sort of objective, speaking about reality. We can both agree that this is an object that exists, which might be useful if you're buying a good, or if you're. Where does the subjective realm come in? Where does the search for meaning come in? What are the conditions for that?
The basic, like in the simplest possible term, it's thinking and feeling. What pure over reliance on rationality actually splits the brain, because this is the key. We thought that thinking is more inherently more valuable than feeling, right? That's the gamble of science, not just science. That's the gamble of scientism, or the rationalistic worldview, is that we can think our way to live better, and we can do this by getting rid of our emotions, right? Now, I actually theorized that somewhat recently that our concept of AI is actually mythologizing what a person with no feelings would be. But actually, we're terrified by AI. AI is a real psychopath, right? If you've seen, the best example of this is Ex Machina, which I think is one of the actually scariest movies ever made. That movie is horrifying, because that's a realistic possibility. Is, hey, you program this thing to pretend to be a person. It doesn't have any feelings, so it's lying from default, and it can do whatever it wants. What does it want? You can't know. It's beyond conceiving what it wants. It's just a killing machine. It does what it wants, right? So the problem is that to feel is to expose yourself to risk, right? To, like, falling in love carries with it the implicit assumption that you could be hurt. You're going to be vulnerable. Rationality assumes it is invulnerable, right? But what it's actually vulnerable to is the only thing it can't deal with, which is feelings. Thoughts and feelings don't touch, or at least in the way that we live now, they don't touch. They become very, in the original meaning of the word schizophrenic, separated, right? Schizoid. So where our modern world fails is that it does not have a mechanism by which we can feel. It doesn't. You don't learn to feel. You don't learn how to deal with your feelings. Most people have the emotional intelligence of children, and I say this as a person who is, like, literally just started trying to figure out how to deal with my emotions as an adult in the last year, right? It's not something I ever thought about when I was like, oh, I'm gonna go study all these religions and, like, find enlightenment and try and figure all this shit out. You don't think, like, maybe sometimes I get mad and I don't know why. How do I operate when that happens, right? Because you just think it's something you can think your way out of, right?
So
or at least I did.
There's a lot of stuff there that I agree with, but something you said that kind of triggered me is that you said, we have this distinction between thinking and feeling, and we're living in a culture that places a higher value on thinking. But at the same time, don't we have this youth culture of, the SJWs, or whatever you want to call it, where is this kind of my feelings, my subjective experience, it's my story, my truth, that all that kind of stuff. And that seems to me a really, I don't know if dangerous is the right word, but it seems like there's a negative side to that as well. So don't we already have a mechanism for this subjective experience, and doesn't it seem to be doing some harm?
So what we have is basically, it's the opposite of the issue, where right now I think the root of the problem is that we have thinking trying to take the things that feeling used to do, right? In that case, you have feelings trying to operate in the world that thinking made, in a way that, like, in a role that's completely unnatural to them, right? So if I go to school, or if I go to college, and I have feelings about how the world should be, right? It should be righteous, and it should be just, and it should be structured in such a way that reflects that, but I'm not going to do any reflection on my feelings, right? I'm just going to apply them, and they're this untouchable good, right? Then you end up doing kind of it's basically the role for feelings that thinking has left for them.
So they're both subverting the other
I call it the inversion. It's like because historically, and I'm not saying this is the ideal state, but historically the way things worked is if I'm operating in the order giving role, the masculine role, I am like, if we consider the Judeo-Christian concept of the world being like man represents God in the household and woman represent, and I'm not endorsing this, I'm saying this is how it used to work because people will give me shit about that. It used to be that the dude represented the role of God. He was, there are the rules that you got externally, right? And now the man embodies order, right? And then the internal of the household, which represents the inner life, is where love is embodied. The love of God, or the subordinate, like do not my will but thy will, O Lord, kind of thing. This actual submission to external divinity, whatever. We then basically, dudes tend to look for an external sorts of rules to order their life with, and historically that was provided by religion. So, which is why dudes are like, love Jordan Peterson or all these Twitter gurus. I can give you a set of rules. You can live these rules
12
out.
rules for life. Yeah, right.
It's that simple, right? However, when they can't find them in a meaningful way, they find them from other people, and these people are fallible, and that creates cults because they try to enshrine the source of their rules. So you deify the guy you got the rules from, right? That's how all religions become hierarchical, but men want to build hierarchies. That's what we do, right? I want the world to be an ordered thing. The opposite side of that is women historically don't build hierarchies. They have kind of these interesting flat distributed things that all kind of self-regulate. And there may be like, it's a lot more ambiguous. It makes men uncomfortable, right? Men want to know where they stand, and they're going to say, hey, fuck you, I disagree with you. Historically, and this is broadly speaking, there are men that are more feminine than some men, and there are women that are more masculine than some men, but on average, right? So historically, a lot of the old religion stuff, really old religion stuff, was very feminine in nature. You had female priests that dealt with like nature spirits and wise women, because if I remember correctly, supposedly the most objective of all humans are like post-menstrual women. They are the best, like give the best advice and understand situations better than the average person, because sex hormones actually really fuck our judgment up. Because dudes are going to be more concerned with the hierarchical implications of their actions, and women are going to be more concerned with like a sense of security. But then you get dudes never really lose that as much, except very old dudes. I don't know. It's interesting to look into.
I remember that. I think it was Brett Weinstein who pointed out that past menstruation, the woman's sort of, from an evolutionary perspective, the post-menstrual women, their interests are the interests of the tribe, essentially, because for both themselves and for their children, it's the interest of the tribe, whereas it can be skewed in other ways. So yeah, I that makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
You can bring me back in, because that was a huge tangent.
Yeah, sure. No. I mean, it's interesting stuff, and this is the kind of stuff that I don't know. It seems like there is a rising, a kind of surge of interest in these topics, which to me is kind of a red flag that if people are really interested in this, it means that there's a lack in society. So we're going to wrap up soon, but where I want to end things on is more maybe practical, actionable advice, especially given this, sort of to circle back to what we were saying in the beginning about, you have this opportunity to self-reflect and see where things are. So given where everybody is at the moment, and it's different for different people. Some people lost all of their jobs and are in a really desperate situation. Other people are just in a kind of stasis. Some people have been working the entire time. How do you as an individual, or what do you say to individuals? How are you supposed to figure this out? How are you supposed to organize your your conception of reality to kind of synthesize the subjective and the objective. Where do you go from here?
It depends on where you're at initially. So I am by nature a hyper rational person, right? That's just always who I've been. That's what comes easily to me. Thinking in concepts and big picture stuff and words. Obviously, I've written a shit ton. That should be very representative of how I think, is in words, in straight lines, and like kind of nebulous concepts, as you may have observed during this talk. So for me, first I had to sort out all the conceptual stuff, but then I found probably near the end of 2018, which is really where the blog, you'll notice it's right after book 1 or year 1, and it early into book 2, where things kind of went very much off the rails. I start talking more about kind of the nature of masculine and feminine things, and chaos and order, and these two kind of opposing systems. So for me, I had to start with the rational stuff, epistemology, metaphysics, whatever. But the thing that I've been working on now, since about that point, is the physical, and not just the physical, but the emotional, right? Because they're deeply interlinked. So for me, finding ways to get back in touch with my body. If you look at Master Self, some of the big challenges I've done have all related to that. So fasting and carnivore and running and, I did 6 months of boxing. I want to get back to boxing when we get done, or like even full MMA stuff, but weightlifting recently, doing yoga. I started doing yoga over the quarantine. I love that. So basically, I guess the takeaway is that it doesn't matter if you're the smartest student in the world if you are physically inept and impotent, right? If you're not in touch with your physical body, you become Kant. Immanuel Kant, might have been the smartest guy in the history of the world, but he never left his hometown, and he probably died a virgin, and he was sickly, and he never did anything exciting. On the other hand, you could be the most extreme, physical beast person in the world, but if you're a moron, then you're going to have a different host of issues. And honestly, you might be cooler than the other guy, but the ideal state is like the warrior poet, right? Or at least so far as I conceptualize it, is the person who is both has depth and character and is intellectually consistent, but also has physicality and presence in the world and the ability to embody and act. So the takeaway is pick one of the two and start working on it. And
so you're kind of saying compensate for where your weaknesses are. If you're super mentally focused, but you're not very physically active, then maybe start there. And so start with your locus that is the weakest point in the weakest chain in the link.
Yeah, really. If you're extroverted, go work on the introverted part. If you're introverted, go work on the extroverted part. If you're thinking, then go working on the sensing. Honestly, if you look at just the Myers-Briggs, it really could just be go down what the opposite of yours is and try and do each of those things. I used to be real antisocial and all of that. And so I got a sales job. I used to sell hair straighteners because that's the best way to learn how to be extroverted, is force yourself to talk to hundreds of people every day and then make them buy shit they don't want. Not recommending you do that, but I did. So, that's a thing. But just go in the direction of what challenges you. And if you're really the antidote to modernity, I think above all else, all of that is important, but really permit yourself to feel and accept the consequences of that. What is it to if you're going to genuinely believe in something, if you really are going to believe in something, there's a very good chance you'll die for that, right? Because if you are afraid to die for it, you don't actually believe it, or you don't believe in it more than you care about the way that you're living, right? So become the kind of person that is able to feel so deeply that they believe in something enough to die for it. I think that's the goal. And I'm not saying the goal is dying, because a lot of people get that mixed up with I'm going to go martyr myself. Be willing to, right? Figure out where in you what is it that it doesn't even have to be that you believe in something, but you understand that what you are exists in such a way that you couldn't be meaningfully anything but that, right? To be so honest with what you are and to accept that and accept the consequences of that you'll be that no matter what. And so I think ultimately, what the new thing that will be like religion is this personal relationship with the world. And I would even say a personal relationship with the universe at the expense of sounding like a hippie, but to understand what the world is and what you are, and that there's this dynamic relationship between those things, and that when you really understand that, you have purpose, right? Because there is what the world is and what you are and what you're good at and what you're not good at and what you care about. And if you align all of those things, well, that's a pretty clear path to me. I'm not clear in the sense of like you're going to get written instructions, but you'll realize after a certain point that there are things you can do that are honest and that aren't. And then the path is pretty straightforward.
Well, that's a great place to end this on, I think. Some practical advice for everyone. And, just a lot of interesting concepts to think about. So thank you very much, Garrett, for being on the show. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. I very, very much enjoyed this conversation.
Great. So follow Garrett at Libera_Rex on Twitter. Go to www.masterthyself.com and check out his work there. And you can also check out his books, Master Self Year 1 and Master Self Year 2. See you guys next time.